Welcome to our Wisconsin DPI Literacy Unconference 2014 session, Beyond Collecting Data, Applying Data in a Multi-Level System of Support. I'm Laura Adams, one of the literacy consultants here at the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction.
And I'm Barb Novak, the other literacy consultant at the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction. Thanks for joining us.
This particular presentation was developed in collaboration with our Wisconsin RTI Center Literacy TACs, Lynn Johnson and Sarah Nelson. So at the end of this session today, we hope that you will understand how data at the single classroom level fits within a multi-level system of support, that you understand what a systemic and systematic data analysis process could look like, that you use data to apply a systemic and systematic process to match instruction to student needs, that you're able to analyze and draw conclusions based on literacy data, and that you consider how this process could be applied in your school.
Basically, we're going to lead you through a process that will allow you to make decisions about whole group, small group, and individual instruction based on data that you collect as a teacher on a regular basis.
So we're going to begin with an overview of Wisconsin's RTI framework. And again, the power in a process like this one is not when one teacher is engaging in such a process with his or her own classroom data, but when such a process is used throughout a school, across a grade level or across a content area. And so you're going to notice that we're going to keep coming back to that idea, because that's how we'll really strengthen and develop a multi-level system of support. So let's begin just by reviewing our principles for RTI in Wisconsin. This is what guides everything we do around RTI. First and foremost, RTI is for all children and all educators. RTI must support and provide value to effective practices. We don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Success for RTI lies within the classroom through collaboration. RTI applies to both academics and behavior, and when we're talking about behavior, what we're talking about here is PBIS. RTI supports and provides value to the use of multiple assessments to inform instructional practices. RTI is something you do, not necessarily something you buy. And RTI emerges from and supports research and evidence-based practice. You'll notice throughout today's presentation that you'll really see element number 3 and element number 5. So again, that piece about the importance of collaboration to really strengthen the system, and number 5, multiple assessments. So here is a graphic that represents Wisconsin's vision for a response to intervention. So notice that the outer ring is our multi-level system of support. So we have systems and structures in place to support all students. Notice that the elements within that multi-level system of support are collaboration, balanced assessment, and high-quality instruction. Running through the core of the multi-level system of support and touching on each of those 3 components of RTI is culturally responsive practices. You can read more about Wisconsin's vision for RTI by following that link at the bottom of the screen. And of course, as our supports are intensified for students, each of those 3 components would be intensified. So we want to really strengthen our system by making sure that we're being both systematic and systemic. So what we're doing today is we're sharing one example of a process for analyzing your literacy data in order to make decisions about instruction, individual, small group, and whole class instruction. Having a series of steps is that systematic piece. It's having a system or a method or a plan. But again, in order to really strengthen your multi-level system of support, that plan needs to be systemic. It's not one teacher and using that plan in isolation. It's all teachers across a building, across a content area, or across a grade level. And that there's really intentional time built in to collaborate around that process, and that the plan itself is very intentional. So again, just really hammering home the importance of collaboration and the fact that you really need to make sure that you have time for collaboration. That's a systematic process of collective problem solving and planning for teaching and learning. The use of data to adjust instruction, policies, and practices, that should all be done in collaboration, guided by protocols, at school and team levels, with multiple perspectives. This is just a way to think about a multi-level system of support. This is a roadmap that was developed by the Wisconsin RTI system. You'll notice that no matter where a student falls after that, in that screening process, that we are addressing all three elements of a multi-level system of support: the instruction, the collaboration, and the balanced assessment. So when we start analyzing literacy data, we just want to remind you of the fact that we really want to emphasize having a comprehensive literacy framework. Because often what happens is when we start to analyze that data, what we may notice is that we need to work on particular discrete skills, especially in reading. And that's an important part of the process, but it's equally important to make sure that we bring those discrete skills back to the whole. A comprehensive literacy framework would integrate reading, writing, listening, speaking, using language, employing technology, and researching across content areas. All of those things in combination are what promotes critical thinking. So while it may be important for some students to work on particular discrete skills, it's also important to bring those puzzle pieces back to the whole. So just a reminder that we have lots of different types of assessment data, and the kind of assessment data that we're really going to be focusing on today are both the formative and benchmark data. And this slide really captures the essence of the session. Collecting data is great, but using data to make instructional decisions is what's most important. If you're not actually using that data to inform your instruction and meet the needs of your learners, then why are you doing it? And again, we want to use that data to make instructional decisions at the individual student level, the small group level, and the whole class level.
So let's dig into this process that we've created for you. The process is actually 5 questions, which you see on the left-hand side of the slide, and we'll walk through each of those questions with a model for you. Then the other thing we've provided as part of this session is 4 different scenarios. If you want to practice the questions, you can certainly use one of the sample scenarios that we've developed for you, but even better, you could use your own data from your own classroom and practice the questions with that data. So here you see the 5 questions. They look really linear on the screen, right? It seems like you would answer question 1, then you'd answer question 2, then you'd answer question 3, and go right down the list. But in actuality, this is really a recursive process. For example, the second question, what does data suggest large group, small group, and individual instruction should focus on? You can't really answer the second question without also engaging in the third question. What additional data needs to be collected? So this process of determining priorities for instruction and what individual student needs are is directly informed by additional data collection. So you'll find yourself going back and forth between some of the steps in these questions. The other thing that's important to remember that we continue to talk about is that these questions are really meant to be answered in collaboration. That might mean that all of the teachers at our particular grade level are looking at their student data at the same time and answering these questions. That might mean that a teacher is working with his or her co-teacher to answer these questions. and the outcome is always the same. What are the priorities for whole group instruction, small group instruction, and individual instruction? And those might be different from classroom to classroom. If all the fourth grade teachers are together in the same room looking at their data and answering these questions, they're not necessarily going to come up with the same conclusions about whole group, small group, and individual instruction, because those conclusions are based on the students that are actually in their class.
When we're thinking about collaboration, we should also be thinking about how to connect to those support personnel. For example, if you have Title I programming, if you have interventionists in any way, it would be really important to make sure that you're connecting those folks to this process and that data as well.
So we want to walk you through the questions with a set of sample data. That's what you see on your screen now. These are oral fluency screening data scores for 6 students from a third grade classroom. They're not the only 6 students in that classroom, but they're the 6 students that we could easily fit on the screen for you to take a look at today. So the first question really asks you to think about what Common Core state standards and general literacy skills are addressed in the data. So when you're working to find an answer to this question, you're really thinking about, what does this data measure? What is this data even really telling me? In the case of the oral fluency screening data, we felt that that was directly connected to Reading Foundational Standard 4. Read with sufficient accuracy and fluency to support comprehension. But it's not as simple as that. We know that there's a lot of other Common Core state standards that influence whether or not a student is a fluent reader. And we know that a student's ability to read fluently either helps or hinders his or her ability to meet other Common Core state standards. So fluency is really something, we know this from research too, fluency is really something that's connected to a student's ability to master a lot of different standards. So once we've decided what standards and general literacy skills are addressed in the data, it's time to really start thinking about what we want to do for our whole group, small group, and individual instruction. And like I said earlier, that's directly influenced by this process of collecting additional and ongoing data, almost like a diagnosis process. And then that diagnosis cycles back to inform instruction. So the first thing we ask you to do is decide how to sort your data. So you have this huge pile of data. Maybe it's oral fluency screening data like we showed you earlier. Maybe it's scores from the Fountas and Pinnell assessment. Maybe it's data from Ames Web. Maybe it's student writing samples. But you have this huge amount of data, and you have to decide how you want to sort it, what patterns that you want to look for. We recommend that you think about what the data actually measures, what Common Core state standards and general literacy skills are represented in the data, and we really encourage you to remember that literacy is a complex process, and there's probably more to the data than there appears to be at the surface. I think this is a time when collaboration might be particularly helpful. If you have a room full of fourth grade teachers together, you can all determine the best way to sort the data. The collective expertise, I think, will really be helpful here. So this is how we're choosing to sort our oral fluency screening data. We're doing a quadrant sort. Not because we want to end up with 4 small groups, but because these are the patterns that we felt were emerging in the data. Some students were accurate and fluent, other students were accurate but had a slow rate, some students were inaccurate and had a slow rate, and some students were inaccurate but had a high rate. So we really looked at the data and thought about what patterns we saw there, and then sorted students according to those patterns. That's how we came up with the groups for this particular sort. So then we looked at the student scores and we placed them into the quadrants based on their scores. So you see the student names in yellow on this slide. Now we're really starting to think more about large group focus lessons, small group lessons, individual lessons, and priorities for conferences. I tend to go back and look at where students sorted into and think about the areas that have the most students in them as the priorities for large group instruction, remembering that For large group instruction, it's really important to think about what additional supports or challenges are needed for specific students within the lessons. You have some students in your large group lessons who already have it. They're going to need some additional challenges. And you have some students in your large group lessons that the large group lesson is really going to be a struggle for. They're going to need some additional support. So plan for those things up front. Once you start to determine what your priorities are for small group lessons and individual lessons, you may find that it's necessary to collect some more data. That really moves us into this third question: what additional data needs to be collected? So we brainstormed about the things that might be next steps for students in each of these groups. For example, you'll see that for students who are inaccurate and have a slow rate, they might need phonics instruction, they might need some work on phonological awareness, maybe structural analysis, maybe word recognition, and we won't know where to start that individual or small group instruction unless we do additional assessment. So you see us going back and forth between question 2 and question 3.
Nothing's ever neat and tidy in education.
Especially not in literacy. So you'll see that there are a lot of different things that could be causing Tim to be an inaccurate reader with a slow rate. So we could do some additional diagnostic assessment to determine which of these things we might want to focus on first and which of these things Tim might already understand. So we can really make sure that that individual instruction is getting Tim exactly what he needs. One of the things that we could do would be some miscue and error analysis. That's what you see a sample of on your screen now. We actually have a whole nother unconference session that talks about analyzing running records to make instructional decisions. We encourage you to visit that session for some additional ideas about individual and small group instruction. So what we just did in 2 or 3 slides is a very, very simplified version of an ongoing process that you engage in as a teacher all the time. What's going to result from that process is instructional focus for whole group, small group, and individual instruction, making some decisions about what standards you want to meet, what individual targets you want to move students towards, and what resources you're going to need to get students there. That leads us to our 4th question. What resources do you have available for use within large group, small group, and individual instruction? One of the most valuable resources you have, we've already talked about, and that's time. Thinking about how you want to allocate your time. How much time do you want to spend on whole group instruction? How often do you want to do that during the week? How much time do you want to spend on small group instruction? How much time can you spend on individual instruction? Really using your data to make intentional decisions about how to allocate your time is the first step in deciding what resources you have. When you're thinking about resources, you also want to identify instructional practices. We do have a great, completely free website that you can visit. It's the Classroom Strategies and Practice Bank. You see a screenshot and the web address for you here. The Classroom Strategies and Practices Bank has research-based strategies for each of the strands within the Common Core State Standards, and it even breaks those instructional strategies apart by cluster within the standards. So if you find that a student is struggling with key ideas and details, we have research-based strategies all set for you that you can implement immediately. No purchase necessary. Besides thinking about instructional practices, you also want to identify the texts that you'll use in instruction. Maybe in your whole group instruction, your large group instruction, one of the things that you could do is provide texts at varying levels of complexity to really help students who may be struggling or students who need an additional challenge. You can handle that through text complexity. You'll also want to be thinking about what assessments you'll be using, and we encourage you to think about professional development as a resource. Maybe you have a literacy coach or an instructional coach in your building. Maybe your principal serves in that capacity. Maybe there's classrooms within your buildings or in nearby school districts that you could visit to learn more about instruction. Maybe there's some professional reading that you need to do to really learn how to better meet the needs of your students. Once you've started to think about your resources, you're going to want to remind yourself that the knowledge and skills represented in the data are just one very small part of the overall complex process of literacy. Like we said earlier, reading, writing, speaking, listening, language development, research, they're all reciprocal processes. And we need students to be able to effectively engage in each of those processes. So your instruction needs to be designed in a way that helps students make connections. It's also important to note that the Common Core State Standards ask students, all students, to engage in incredibly rigorous, higher order thinking that's creative and collaborative. So yes, there are definitely students that we need to provide very targeted instruction in discrete skills, maybe in small groups, maybe individually, but we constantly need to be sure that we're providing students with what they need to be able to engage in that higher order thinking. So we're not just working on discrete skills, we're also making sure that we're pulling everything back together so that we're developing as a literate individual.
Really helping students see the purpose for working on those discrete skills. So next steps after viewing this session, we hope that you make time for collaboration with your colleagues around a data set. And again, you can use the example data sets that are posted with this session. You'll also find that perhaps you want to share those example data sets with colleagues in your school district. Another thing that you obviously could choose to use is your own student data. And again, we want you to collaborate across grade levels within your content area to make sure that you are addressing that systemic piece of your process. So prepare the data for collaboration, again, following the process that we have outlined, looking for patterns within that data. They may end up in 4 groups as we have shown. They may not. It all depends upon your own data. And applying the questions that we've formulated to the data to plan instruction. You may find that it makes sense to tweak those questions for your particular context or to modify the process, and that's fine. You should always do what makes the most sense for your own particular context. So if you have any questions or you're looking for additional support, additional resources, please contact us. Again, Barb and I worked in collaboration with our Wisconsin RTI Center Literacy Tacs, Sarah Nelson and Lynn Johnson, so their contact information appears here as well. Please remember to join the conversation by tweeting with us. We are always posting just-in-time resources on our literacy Twitter feed @WithDPILit. And don't forget that there's a hashtag associated with this unconference. So join the conversation by using that hashtag #WithUncon, and posing a question or a thought specific to this particular session. Get some conversation started with your colleagues around the state. Thanks for joining us today. We hope that you are enjoying your Literacy Unconference experience this year.
Thanks, everyone.